Hello.
Like, do I get a sign up?
Hello and welcome to the LSE, and welcome to the LSE School of Public Policy public event. My name is Alexander Evans. I'm Associate Dean of the School of Public Policy and a Professor in Practice, and I'm delighted to be joined by Claire Yorke, Dr. Claire Yorke today. And we'll be talking about her new book, but also about empathy in general. But just before I do that, there's the obligatory service announcements, which I should make. So let me give them, if that's all right. So the first thing is just to ask, please put your phones on silent, because that TikTok alert or the urgent WhatsApp can sometimes intrude on the flow of an event. This event is being recorded, so see a camera up there, and will hopefully be made available as a podcast and as a video on all the usual LSE channels. And as always, there will be a chance for you to put questions to Claire during the event, and we'll open up to Q&A. Obviously, speeches disguised as questions are not always welcome, and you may be displaying a lack of empathy if you do that. So please, can I recommend when we do open it up, please put your hand up, and we'll come to you, and we'll let you know. For those of you who are online, welcome. Very nice to have you here. You can submit your questions via the Q&A feature, and my colleague will be looking at them and flagging those questions to us. So we will bring some of the online questions in. And obviously, the key thing is empathy in politics and leadership. Claire's new book. Copies are available, and the good news is you don't have to go to your local bookshop or to an online outlet, because the Gilded Acorn are selling copies just outside the room. And I'm sure, Claire, subject to your time, you'll be willing to sign a few afterwards. That's great. So look, this is an event about empathy. Can empathy transform politics and leadership? And in this contested world we're in, one could argue that empathy perhaps has gone slightly out of fashion, right? It feels a little bit 2010. But there is an argument to be made that empathy is absolutely key to political leadership, to listening to citizens, whether you are on the right, on the left, in the centre, to negotiating and solving international conflicts, to engaging as leaders in public organisations or otherwise. So it's that leadership angle as well, Claire, that's very much relevant in your book. Claire's new book, by the way, she has already got a corpus of material published on empathy, and I use it in teaching MPP and MPA students here at the LSE. But her latest book, Empathy in Politics and Leadership, basically looks at the wider context of empathy and leadership, looking at political leaders, looking at what do you do around politics and society, around the media, around electoral politics. So how do we think about and bring back empathy into the context of thinking about leadership? I won't go at great length on Claire, but Dr. Claire Yorke is an author and academic who specialises in the role of empathy and emotions in international affairs, security, politics, leadership and society. She's currently a senior lecturer at the Centre for Future Defence and National Security with Deakin University in Canberra, Australia. So she has come a long way to be with us this evening. And you're also teaching, I think, national security students at the War College as well, right? So teaching military as well as civilian students. In an international career, she's lived in the UK, France, Denmark, and the United States. And in fact, I think we first met at Yale, right? And between September 21 and 23, she was a Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellowship at the Centre for War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark, leading a project on empathy in international affairs. Prior to that, she was a Henry A. Kissinger postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale. She got a PhD in international relations from the Department of War Studies, King's College London. We will forgive her for that. It's quite close by. And you did visit here, right, during that time. So that was great. But you've also got a master's in Middle East politics from Exeter and a BA in politics, international relations and French. Don't forget the French. From Lancaster University, and you spent a year at Seymour Po in Yale during that as well. So Claire, look, let's go straight in. And I wanted to open by asking you a little bit of a question. Okay, what's this book about? And if empathy was a bit on message in 2010, why should it be on message now in 2025?
Yes, it's a great question, and I want to thank Alexander and Carolina and LSE for welcoming you here, and to all of you for being here. It's a pleasure to join you. So this book originated really in 2020, at the time when we were seeing a lot of positive stories about our leaders. I'm sure many of you remember that as we went into lockdown, people like Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand took a very empathetic approach to the crisis and really centered people in care and health approaches, and then received a huge amount of praise from international media about this new turn in empathy, that maybe this was when we started to see the kind of politics that put people first and that really made empathy a core part of how we engaged with each other. So when I first got the call from my editor, Joe, it was very much about writing about a positive idea of empathy can transform the world. And obviously, I believe very much that empathy is absolutely critical to effective politics. But what we saw in the years that followed was that that idea of empathy became tested. Prime Minister Ardern received critiques and criticism for her approach. There was resistance to it. A number of other leaders who'd also been championed for their empathy found that actually being in office was quite challenging, that they were receiving a huge amount of hostile reaction from citizens. And we saw as well that some of the strong men in politics were returning to power. Those who maybe one might argue had demonstrated less empathy during the crisis were actually gaining popularity again and rising to power. And so for me, it posed a really interesting tension about, well, if empathy is so important, why is it so hard? Why do we struggle with it? Why do we not see more of it? So it started as a book on leaders, but it's evolved, and actually now it's much more about politics in a broader sense. So first few chapters talk a bit about why leaders are so important, what makes for effective leaders, why do we need leaders who are empathetic at times of crisis. But I found that it's actually too passive from us as citizens to wait for leaders to make that change. And I actually started to interrogate, well, what does it mean then for how we think about politics more broadly? That we need to interrogate what we reward and what we value in our politics. Why is it that we do value and reward the strong men at the moment? Why are they gaining in prominence? How do we think about power, and what does success look like in politics? And I argue that we need to really move from this idea of power over to power with, and start to create far more pluralistic politics that encourages politicians and people to collaborate far more, to engage more constructively in solving the problems of the current moment. And it's also about the stories we tell, that we have to start telling more inspiring stories about the kind of societies we want, about what we want to see. I touched a little bit, for example, on well-being economics, also about the importance of our politics to confront some of the very difficult politics that we see. We actually need to be talking about systemic and structural inequality. We need to talk about why people are being marginalized, why some people are experiencing prejudice and abuse within the political system. And kind of having those difficult conversations are key to better politics. But it also, a key argument of the book is that it's also on us as citizens. We have to start being active agents within our democracy, because that is the beauty of a democracy. We're all meant to have a voice, we're meant to be represented, but we have to not be so apathetic that we leave it to other people to make those choices. And so one of the real sources of hope that I found, and I know at the present moment politics can look quite bleak and quite dispiriting, and I've certainly been on a journey with this book in trying to confront my own kind of disappointment in political systems. But actually a huge source of hope for me is what citizens are doing. There's a huge number of organizations. And when I was living in Yale, I encountered organizations like Bridge USA and Brave Angels, who are doing a lot, especially on campus, to bridge the divides between people who vote differently, who maybe are from different faiths, from different backgrounds. When I was in Denmark, there's a number of organizations there, some of which feature in the book. For example, Stay des Amler, and I apologize to anyone Danish in the room, my accent is really bad, who try and empower citizens to come up with solutions to the problems that they face. And we see this as well in Australia, in the UK, around the world. There's a huge number of people who are innovating and who are connecting with people in their communities to make that change. So the book is a little bit of a call to say, if we want empathetic politics, we can't just wait around for a leader to deliver it. We have to be part of demanding it, contributing to it, and co-creating it.
So thanks, Claire. So what is empathy for you? Because we all know it. We all know it when it engages with us deeply. But it's quite difficult to articulate sometimes what empathy is. What is empathy for you?
Yeah, so in short, empathy is about understanding different lived experiences, about understanding how different people perceive and experience the world, understanding the context that they're operating from. So in part, we often talk about the shorthand of it's stepping into the shoes of someone else. But actually, it goes a bit further than that. It's about being curious about, well, not what would I do if I was in their shoes, but what are they doing because of where they're at in society, because of the life opportunities they've had, the histories that they come from. And a huge part of empathy that we miss is it's also about self-reflection. It should be iterative. It should be this process of understanding how do people experience me, or especially in the context of diplomacy, which I teach, how do people experience what I represent, the country I represent, the background I represent? Why might they not trust me as much as others? Why might they be fearful of what I promise because maybe they've been let down? So empathy is about understanding diverse perspectives. It's about being curious, but it's also about humility and self-reflection.
Now, so some people might think that empathy is necessarily about being charismatic or warm.
Mm-hmm.
Can you be empathetic as a leader or a politician or a citizen without necessarily being kind of a full-on ray of sunshine or sort of emoting left, right, and centre?
Absolutely. And part of the problem is that politics is always in the abstract. So none of us, or very few of us, ever actually know our elected leaders. So that's why attributes like charisma and warmth matter, because that makes us feel like maybe they are connected with us. But I think you can absolutely be empathetic and maybe not be the most charismatic leader, but then we want to see it in terms of words and actions. We want to see that they're asking the right questions, that they're reaching out to people beyond their own circle, that they're bringing more people into the debate, that they're also following up with actions. Like if you learn something about what's not going right in society and you've explored how different people experience the world, are you doing things to address that and make it better? So charisma makes people maybe connect more quickly, but we also need to be cautious of those leaders who might have excessive charisma, but maybe don't match it with substance.
So that the overwattage of charisma shouldn't be mistaken for empathy at times.
Yeah.
Now, some of the critics I talk to, and I teach empathy to a bundle of political candidates every year, or people involved in politics every year. And some of the pushback I get from left and right in the UK is, it's all good and well, but basically empathy is ending up what you're asking. You're focusing so much on the other, but you don't maintain the kind of moral centre or anchor on what you stand for or what you're trying to promote. Is there a risk that too much empathy actually leads to a slipstream where you can't maintain an anchor in your principles or your position, and you can't lead to try and change people as distinct from being led by whatever prevailing mood music in the crowd might be?
Yeah, it's a great question and a really valid point. And so in the book, I argue that we want empathy from our leaders, but we also want conviction. We want to feel that they stand for something, that they have a moral compass. We want to feel that they also have integrity and that they have the courage to do what's difficult. And I think for the most part, many of us do respect that in leaders. And I argue that empathy without boundaries, if you just have this kind of constant expansive empathy, there's a danger, like you say, that you lose that moral certainty and that ground. So it's about having a sense of what you stand for and what matters, being open to having your opinion changed and being curious about how different people see. I think that there's that famous quote about when the facts change, I change my mind. And I think it's that kind of idea of politics that we've got to a situation in politics where, at least to many of us on the outside, it looks like people are changing their minds with the passing of fads. And so we want to see people who stand fast in that. And that they're able to express care, speak to people's concerns, and then take them with them on the journey and try and maybe create, and this is part of the argument, we create more holistic policy as a result. Maybe it involves more compromise. Maybe it isn't quite what the politicians set out at the outset, but that you create this more collaborative approach to politics, more tuned.
Now, we might want more empathetic politicians. Should we have a bit more empathy for politicians as well? I mean, let's face it, it's a pretty grim life, right? You're constantly on. You're subject to attacks in the media. If you're a female politician in pretty much any democracy today, you're subject to almost constant attacks, including threats of violence online. Are we expecting a bit too much? We're looking for sort of a perfectly formed politician, and also we're not always treating our politicians with much empathy either.
Exactly. And I mean, I see one of my wonderful friends and colleagues from my parliamentary days in the audience, and I hope that she would agree that when you work with politicians, they actually do care about people and they care about issues. They mainly have joined politics for the right reasons. And obviously you'll always get certain exceptions, but you get that in any profession. Teachers, nurses, you'll always get some people who maybe aren't always in it for the same reasons to help people, although that's rare. And the same with politics. And so it's about understanding that they're doing a very difficult job. Their whole lives are under scrutiny. They often, at least in the UK system, they're spending most of the week away from their families, from their homes, often traveling very far distances. And the challenge as well is that when they empathize, they might empathize with you, but still be empathizing with thousands of other people. So the decision they arrive at may not be exactly what you think, but they're trying to do the best they can in a system where they're connecting with large constituencies. And I think there's a real argument that we have to maybe give our politicians a little bit more grace. And we have to understand that the challenges that they face are very complex. They're dealing with critical issues. They have a lot more information than we do. And they're doing a difficult job, often under a lot of pressure, with a lot of media scrutiny, especially, as you say, for women who are typically scrutinized for what they wear rather than their ideas and their capabilities. And I think that's really about trust. And we need to do far more as citizens and as politicians to rebuild the trust in each other and within society.
Now, it's one thing to be empathetic about politicians. Politicians tend to say that they understand all their constituents, right? There's that sort of almost that sort of political mode of saying, well, I empathise with all 70,000 people in my constituency. That can't be true, right? In the sense it's almost impossible to empathise at scale in that way. And even if you are incredibly social, you might meet 2,000 or 3,000 people, 3,000 or 4,000 people in your life, but you're not likely to meet all 70,000 of your constituents. So is that tactical empathy that politicians are deploying there? Or is there something genuine about it? Are they really able to say and feel that they represent a wider community?
I mean, in many ways, part of this, especially in the UK, the representative system means that they're much more tuned to the local issues. So you could argue that they have a greater sense of what matters to people in Sunderland or West Cheshire or wherever. But actually, it's very hard to empathise at an emotional level with it. You can't empathise at an emotional level in that constituency, but you can be attuned to the issues that matter. But there is also this idea that I talk about in the book about performative empathy, that we actually expect it from our politicians, that there is an element of talking about how they represent us and how they care about us and how they're seeing and hearing us. And I think that's actually just a natural part of politics that we've become accustomed to. But what we need to see is that they're also just open to the practice of it. So going out into their region, being curious about those people who maybe aren't their electorate, who aren't the people who maybe vote for them. Is the Labour politician leaning across the aisle and trying to understand what the Tory voters in their constituent think? And are they actually trying to represent in the broadest sense? And I think that's where it really has to come through, that we see that they are representing the whole of an area and not just a small portion.
A lot of the wider trends we're seeing, not just in the UK, in the US, elsewhere, right, is greater polarisation and a marked reluctance generally people who, people won't date people with different views, political views to them. People don't associate with them. They don't necessarily even listen to them because of the ecosystem of social media that we now live in. And given that, and given the attention challenge, right, to be able to empathise with somebody, presumably we have to listen to what they're saying.
Absolutely.
We have to slow down and have a sense of who they are and what they value. But actually, we're in a world that's sped up, and we're effectively we're all creatures of these, right, all the time. Is the operating environment today much less empathy friendly than it was even 15 years ago?
Yeah, and we certainly have a competition for our attention spans. I mean, it's just relentless, the amount of information that we have that we didn't several years ago. And one of those classic examples is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where JFK had the time and distance to step back and make a decision because the media were not going to report 24/7 like we have now. And I think the challenge now is that we have to step back a little bit from social media and read a bit more widely around topics. And I'm a big fan of long form journalism, for example, because it gives you the depth, it gives you the nuance, the complexity that you don't get in a 240 or however many character soundbite you now get on something like X or Blue Sky. But listening is integral to empathy. And I think many of us would think we're good at listening, but I'm not sure if we're actually as good as we might think at hearing what's really being said and taking, as you say, time and holding the space and asking the follow-up questions. So often when we listen, we're actually trying to respond with our own opinion, either putting people right, telling them that they're wrong, making ourselves feel like we're smart and we're in the loop, but actually the time you spend just taking the effort to unpack someone's opinion. And again, I come back to this idea of grace, but I think it's very important, like holding that space for people and not rushing to judgments when we listen. And seeing then, it gives you the opportunity to find common ground. Maybe you don't agree with their first point of argument, but maybe once they unpack it a little bit, you find points of commonality. You see the kind of shared humanity that you both have.
So grace and kindness form part of the kind of the furniture of applied empathy.
Yes.
Can we talk a little bit about men and women? Because obviously men are very good listeners. That's what I'm always told at home. I live in a household entirely of women, and men interrupt most of the time. And so, you know, if you're thinking about active listening or being empathetic, what about this gender notion that somehow empathy is almost a feminine value, and sort of non-empathy, if you like, is perhaps a masculine value? Do you want to perhaps unpack that a bit? Because it is something you write about in the book, isn't it?
It is. There's a chapter on gender, and it is something that, in truth, I'm still trying to unpack because I think there's a lot that goes within that. And in part, I think women are socially conditioned to care. We're often directed towards caring professions. There's certain social expectations about women being caregivers and providers in that way. But I also think that it's a disservice to say that men are not capable of empathy. I know a huge number of hugely empathetic, very kind men who are just as empathetic and kind as the women in their life. And I think we do a disservice to assume that it's something that only women do. And it also is a way to exclude women from power, because if we say that actually empathy is feminine, very feminine and soft, then it means you exclude them from the stronger dimensions that are needed in politics. And so we have to reframe the whole conversation. One, we have to create the space for more men to show the sides of themselves that are emotional, that are caring, which I think any of us who know men in our lives will have seen very frequently, which is everyone, I realize. Sorry. We have to create more space for men to talk about emotions, to show that kind of care, and we have to value it in return. But we also need to start viewing this kind of care and empathy as a strength in itself. That if you want to be good at politics, if you want to be good at creating good societies, at having long-term sustainable solutions, you have to take people with you. And you have to have societies that are cohesive, that feel cared for, that feel seen and heard. And we have to just start to create it as a standard for our politics. Because my fear is slightly when we get too much into the gender debate, and there's absolutely issues about structural inequalities and prejudices that we are facing as women, but also as men. But when we get too much into the gender debate, we're actually distracted from core issues like why is it that our economic system as it is actually not serving any of us? That our politics is not serving any of us, men and women? That there's a lot of things that are going on in our societies that we're not talking about as collectives, that kind of transcend gender.
But thinking about that politics for a moment, it might be tempting to say, well, again, let's roll back 15 years. The model of sort of centrist, attentive, emotive politics is that's the model of empathy in politics. A counter-argument might be, well, actually, if you look at a range of populist politics, you know, the ability to engage with, to listen to attend to people who are left behind, who are, you know, beyond capital cities. The sort of flyover country in the US between the east and west coast, or indeed thinking about parts of the northeast, or even cities like where I come from, Portsmouth in the south of England. What's your sense? And I'm not asking you yet to judge whether Trump is a empathetic politician. I promise you, I will ask that. But I just wondered what your view was of what about the revived politics of attentiveness to people who feel an anti-politics, who feel left behind, where it might be angrier, but is it also empathetic?
Yeah, and I think in some ways it is. And the challenge for us is it empathy if we don't like what it looks like? If actually people are empathizing with people we don't agree with, can it still be empathy? And I would argue yes. But then the question is, why are we not also trying to understand? And I mean, in the final chapter of the book, I really talk about, to go through American politics already, maybe. One of the weaknesses I think we saw with the Democrat campaign, and I was very much hoping they would win, is that they didn't talk to this kind of forgotten middle, that they were talking a lot about issues that maybe didn't address the economic inequality, the lack of jobs, the changing landscape that they were facing and the rapid changes. They weren't really engaging with those concerns. And I think there's a way that politics can be attentive to that while also offering an alternative by saying, maybe it's not actually about the immigrants, maybe it's about economic systems and changing the debate. Because I think what people like President Trump has been very effective at doing is speaking to people who feel left behind and who felt forgotten by systems. It doesn't mean what they offer is right or accurate as a model to address the problems, but I do think there is a form of empathy within that.
Now, obviously, in the BuzzFeed age, it would be wrong if I didn't ask you the BuzzFeed question, which is if you were thinking about the list of politicians that you think deploy or display or indeed live empathy, who would be on your list on that, looking around the world, or indeed looking at past examples as well?
Yeah, and I mean, it's challenging when you don't have access to all different languages of the world, because I would love to know from people in the room from different countries if there are any examples from where you're from that you really think we should look at. One, obviously, I think Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has made it very prominent, both in her recent book, but during her time in office, it was very front of centre. And it informed her even before we saw Christchurch, the tragic terrorist attack in New Zealand in March 2019. A classic example maybe is Nelson Mandela, which we saw President of South Africa, who really made an effort to understand how he would try and reconcile a country and bring them together. I think there's some people such as Mary Robinson of Ireland, I think has really made it a core part of her leadership. And now as part of the elders, she speaks very prominently as well about empathy. It's interesting, people like Obama, President Obama of the United States, also made it a key part of his platform. Even before he was president, he was talking about the empathy deficit. And it was interesting, I wrote an article on strategic communications and empathy. And one of the reviewers got back and said, oh, Obama's not empathetic, he's too intellectual. And so I've naturally, maybe it speaks to my political leanings, that I felt, well, I really liked that he spoke about the philosophy of it, that he really made it an emphasis that America should address the empathy deficit. It should really talk to people left behind. And someone else had said, well, we just don't agree. He's too aloof, he's too intellectual. So I think it speaks to that perception. We will have different perceptions of who we think, but the people I mentioned, I think, are really good examples.
That does tempt me to tell a little anecdote out of church, but when I worked and lived in the States, I worked for Richard Holbrooke in the first Obama administration at Lead Army. At his funeral, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama were there. And there's an interesting sort of clash of styles, as it were, between Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, because there was a bandsman playing at the funeral on the stage at the Kennedy Center in Washington, DC. And Barack Obama's nearly left for Rome, and he turns back and he says, Bill Clinton is glad handing the bandsman. And it's just natural. That's what Bill does, right? Bill is a very empathetic politician, like him or not. And that's not a quality that feels quite so natural, at least visibly, for Barack Obama. So quite interesting, again, just seeing two politicians just with a slightly variegated skill set on this. But I wondered if this perhaps helps lead into the debates. You mentioned Nelson Mandela, and it would be wrong if I didn't ask, as a recovering diplomat, the question about diplomacy, because that's also been part of what you've written about, right? International affairs and empathy. And I just wondered if you could talk about crisis diplomacy in particular. But so two dimensions. To what extent can empathy if applied by politicians, negotiators, diplomats, help avoid crises, prevent wars, minimize or reduce risk between countries. And then when there is a crisis, India, Pakistan this year in May, we're thinking about the crises that have taken place in the Middle East or the continuing war in Ukraine. To what extent can empathy be an asset under those circumstances? And perhaps that also leads into crisis leadership and empathy as well.
Yeah, two really good questions. And I love the issue of empathy and diplomacy. I think there's so much in it, and I'm sure many of you who are studying international relations will have come in contact with it. In terms of anticipating and addressing crises before they happen, for me, empathy, and we talk especially about this in the context of both diplomacy, but also strategic empathy, it helps to identify where are there problems that maybe we haven't anticipated. It helps you to understand the lay of the land much better. It helps you to understand sources of grievance. It helps you to also understand the key players and to build those relations. And a really good diplomat, a really good politician will be ahead of that. They won't just be reaching out to people when something happens. They'll be building that network, building those connections in advance so that when things are escalating, they can start to say, well, what do we need to do? How do we help? They've got the trusted networks, they've got the inside line. But it also helps to kind of develop the narrative of connection that you need before a crisis hits, because when crisis hits, you're going to get very intense emotions. You're going to get far more quick responses that are often based on instinct rather than that capacity to think more slowly and to reflect. So you want to build in as much of a buffer for that before it will happen. And then when crises do hit, I mean, empathy is key, both in terms of understanding, again, what's really going on, but it also bringing people to the table and getting people who are maybe in very different experiences in that moment and in those very intense emotional states to start to humanize the other, to see each other differently. And that's maybe in the context of conflict, but also, for example, in natural disasters, you need leaders who are able to identify what are the public going to be feeling right now? How do I alleviate maybe the fear, maybe the uncertainty, maybe the grief or the frustration that's going on? How do I anticipate their needs? How do I get ahead? And in theory, good policymakers should have those kind of contingencies in place, but it doesn't always happen. And we saw the cost of this during Hurricane Katrina, where, again, George W. Bush was criticized for a lack of empathy. He was up in the plane overhead, and a lot of people were in the flood waters down below without the support, without the care that they needed. And a huge number of people tragically died because there wasn't enough of a response. But we also see it then in crises, and we all lived through that in the pandemic. You want that sense of reassurance. You want leaders who say, I know you're really struggling right now. And people like Mia Motley, who's another good example, I think, of an empathetic leader, of someone who leads with ideas of justice and integrity. She was, again, going on television and saying, I know this is hard for you. It's hard for me too. We've got to get through this. This is what we're going to do. And empathetic leaders in crises create a sense of collective experience and collective community. You're all in this together. We all need to rely on each other to get through this. So it's through the communication, it's through words, it's also through the actions and the efforts they take to deliver on creating and ensuring there's kind of contingency and responses in place.
So I'm hearing themes, Claire, from what you're saying about respect, about kindness, but also about solidarity, right? I mean, not necessarily solidarity in a politicized way, but just that sense of connection and communion with fellow human beings, and how we think of ourselves as a community as well. Let me turn it just in one other direction, if I may, which is obviously in politics, in life, even in universities, allegedly, sometimes people fall out with each other, right?
Yes.
Universities are very kind places, so it never happens in universities, I promise them. But you know, when relationships degrade like that, and I'm not talking about marriage counselling in this sense, but what do we, you know, is there a role that empathy can play to rebuild broken communities, a broken academic department, a broken political relationship within a party? Because remember, I mean, you know, as I certainly my experience in politics has been that the fiercest rivalries tend to be within parties rather than between them.
Yeah.
So what can we, what applied role can empathy take in those circumstances?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely key to help with that. But it's also important to know it's not an easy process. there's often this assumption that something like empathy is soft, that it's a weakness. And actually, I think we shy away from empathy so often because it asks so much of us. It's hard work, it takes courage, it takes a real commitment to step up and say, I've got to sit through very uncomfortable emotions, I've got to sit through difficult perspectives that maybe I don't want to hear in the context you talk about with relationships. Whether that's an academic colleague, whether that's a political member of your party that you've fallen out with, that's being confronted with someone who disagrees with your point of view or the way of doing things and maybe has criticism for you. So again, that to me is about why empathy is also about self-reflection and humility. But it's also about self-empathy. It's that understanding of, I'm not going to get everything right. I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm going to try and correct. And being able to course correct, being able to acknowledge failure is a key part, both in personal relations, academic relations, and in politics. We need to see people say, I'm sorry, I got things wrong. And then be ready to make amends, then be ready to kind of redress and show that they're committed to another solution. And that takes a lot. So I talk about empathy as well in the context of emotional intelligence. We need emotionally agile leaders, and we ourselves need to be emotionally literate. We need to be able to talk about, what are we feeling right now? Why, how is that shaping what we do, how we engage, especially how does it offer a lens for how we perceive the world? Because those emotions can get in our way of sound judgment. So going back to your case of how does it help heal those relations? It's about taking the time and the effort and having patience to invest in the process of, where can we repair? Where can we connect? What is it we do agree on, and how can we build on that more? And how can we disagree civilly, in a way that is respectful, that shows dignity to the other person, but that isn't kind of zero sum?
Am I hearing you suggest within that, but actually we need a space for forgiveness, right? Because often we will offend each other, often politics will break down, relationships break down. How do we, is there a role, including around politics, for greater forgiveness? And it is, again, that's not greatly in fashion right now, is it? I mean, the temptation is one strike and you're out.
Yeah.
And, the digital trail will be there forever afterwards, right? Cancel culture, if you like.
And it's amazing that we're willing to forgive some people far more than others. Some people seem to be Teflon and able to get away with a lot more, and some people seem to kind of fall at the first hurdle. I do think it's about forgiveness. And maybe this is what I talk about when I refer to grace. It's about acknowledging we're all human. We're all fallible. Our politicians just as much as us, and just as much as we maybe don't want to see that because we've created quite a negative image of what politicians are and what they do. We have to accord a certain amount of humanity to that process and fallibility. So I think forgiveness is key, but it's knowing that people are going to actually do something if you do forgive, that they're not going to repeat the same mistakes repeated, over and over again. That it's not just empty words.
Now, what you set out is a kind prospectus for a return of empathy in public life. It's not necessarily the zeitgeist of the world right now, right? Just in general. But it would be wrong. I teach at a public policy school. It'd be wrong if I didn't say, okay, that's great. But what we've done is we've spent quite a lot of time discussing and diagnosing the problem and some of the remedies, but we haven't got very specific, right? So what would you recommend individuals do? Because you said it was collective on us as citizens. What do you recommend governments do if we want to create an environment that is more empathetic, more engaging, greater solidarity, kindness, respect, and focus on understanding each other? What do we do?
So I have a plan of action at the back of the book, which does give a little bit on this. So, I mean, as individuals, there's a number of things we do, and it goes back to points you raised before as well. One is we've got to get better at listening and keep practicing it. We're coming up to Thanksgiving, we're coming up to Christmas, times when we all know there's often fear of tense family debates over the dinner. This doesn't happen in my house, so I should address my house. But it's about listening better, about trying not to always be right. And that's something I think we can all practice. I think it's also about get involved. And this is something that I think is part of the reason why empathy is hard, is there's been a decline of civic space. We're so often online. Get out, get involved, go volunteer. And you don't have to do everything all at once. Find something that matters to you. Maybe it is the environment, maybe it's justice, maybe it's women's rights, maybe it's LGBTQ agenda, maybe it's animal rights. Go and join something that matters and meet people who think like you, but also try and meet people who think differently. And that's why things like sports teams, clubs, maybe it's football, maybe it's chess, maybe it's music, maybe it's volleyball. By engaging with people, we just start to connect better with people. I think at a personal level, that's something I'm very conscious. My answers are quite long. I hope that's okay.
That's okay.
And then I think at a government level, I'd really love to see politicians bridge the gap with citizens much more. I think politicians may be very good at knowing their local area, but as I said, get out and start to know people who think differently, who don't maybe vote for you. I think citizens' assemblies are a great way of helping these conversations, because for us as citizens, they offer us an opportunity to engage in debates and to hear evidence from experts about issues that are often quite heated. And Ireland was very successful in citizens' assemblies around topics like abortion, in actually exposing people to the evidence and then saying, well, what does this mean? So giving people the facts, and it helps to also demonstrate the complexity of politics and the trade-offs, which then also increases our political literacy. I think for politicians as well, it's about demonstrating bipartisanship. Maybe you can't agree on everything, but we've got some really bad infrastructure in terms of trains, in terms of declining health service. How can politicians come together and say, this is in the interest of all of us? How do we work together on this? How do we find common ground? And there's an argument there that I think maybe you can speak to about policymakers. I think there's also scope there for policy to be actually going out. If you are in education policy, are you spending time in a classroom really looking at what teachers have to do, about the load of marking, about the demands on their time, about how much students are coming to them for help and how much for very low pay, actually, given what they do. Same with nurses, same with frontline workers. We need policy that really starts to get out into communities, and I've seen evidence that that is actually happening. There is changing, but can be far more integrated into systems of and processes of policy.
Well, it's an interesting challenge right around local government in most countries, but particularly if I think about the example of the UK, but generally, there's quite a long distance emotionally actually from working in central government to then coming down to the local tiers of government in the UK. And it's quite rare. It's very rare to find a central government civil servant who ends up working in local government. So it's very rare to find somebody who's worked in the Ministry of Justice in London to then be working on justice issues for a local council in Darlington, for example. And there, I would argue, there is actually an applied gap on this, right? Because it means that you end up, and here I'm talking about officials rather than necessarily politicians, but you end up with people who are very distant from the citizens for whom policies apply in a practical way. So I want to ask one other question, and I will open it up to the floor and online. It's about generations, because it's all good and well to talk about empathy, but we're very good in our generational cohorts, right? And there's a lot of sociology around generational cohorts. We tend to think in the age that we come from, and our experiences that ground us are often experiences from our late teens or early 20s. And we know that in lots of societies, there's lots of intergenerational tensions. And I'm not talking about the dinner table at Thanksgiving or Christmas here. I'm talking about issues about money, jobs, public policy, social policy. Is it possible for policymakers and officials who, let's face it, when they're in power, tend to be in their 50s or their 60s, to apply empathy to really engage with people who are coming up in their late teens or 20s or early 30s? And in what ways could empathy applied in public policy and politics help bridge that generational gap?
Oh, what a great question. And it is a theme that we keep seeing, this real gap. I think there's a number of things. One of the challenges I've observed, especially in the policy and politics processes, often we work in quite hierarchical systems, and there's cultural dimensions to that. Some countries are far more hierarchical than others. But it's about our people within bureaucracies asking junior members of staff what they think. Because, often you have certain privileges at certain levels, you're in certain rooms, but actually we need to see leaders at all levels really reaching down and saying, tell us what you think, what do you experience? What are people in their early 20s who are just interns in a government department actually seeing and experiencing? Who are they tapped into in terms of the conversations, and what are they missing? at the senior levels, for those who've maybe been in a profession for 30 years, represent a very different generation and demographic. What can that bring to us? I think there's also scope for us as young people to maybe listen as well to older generations, to how they see it. You know, maybe they see that we have privileges that they didn't, that maybe there's things that we can learn, maybe there's things we're missing. But there's also some really interesting initiatives around bringing those generations together. So taking young people and putting them in old people's homes. There's some really interesting things about co-living arrangements, so that you both address the loneliness that maybe older people feel, while also helping younger people get a greater sense of what their journey has been, what they've been through. I'd like to see the voting age lowered. That's something I talk about in the book. I think, you know, if we're asking people at 16 to go and do very difficult things, we should also be asking, we should also enable them to vote. We should be empowering young people. And a huge source of hope I found is what young people are doing for politics. You know, that young people are at the forefront of climate action. I spoke to a number of people who are really doing innovative things. There's a woman from the Gambia who she's done far more in her career, and she's not yet 30 than I've done in mine, and, you know, just leading that. There's a young man from Kerala who's doing a huge amount about increasing awareness of the environment and what it means. So there's ways that we can start to open those debates. Youth forums, youth assemblies, they've been quite prominent in places like Bangladesh as well. Young people have been very prominent for protesting for change. And so it's about, again, it goes back to opening our political systems, creating more inclusive spaces, inviting more people into the conversations, and holding that space and listening, and using that information to then create change.
Well, thank you, Claire. And I'd certainly echo these themes around porosity, attention, and also challenge are really important. And they're important in long-range policy making for governments as well, and grand strategy as well. It helps you avoid, it doesn't eradicate error, but it helps you reduce the potential for error as well. Now, I'm failing in my duty in being an empathetic chair here, because I can see I'm losing a room. So I promised to open it up, and we will. So I think, can I ask now, who would like to ask a question in the room? Please put your hand up. Please do wait for the mic to come to you. Otherwise, future generations will lose your wisdom, because they won't be able to listen to it on YouTube. So the mic is going to come up. So I've got a hand that's come up over there first. And then I'll come to the gentleman there as well.
You just speak.
And please do say who you are if you don't want to keep your anonymity.
Hi, Claire. Really good to see you. This is Marion Messmer from Chatham House. I'm really looking forward to reading your book, but until I get a chance to do that, I wanted to ask a question about the term strategic empathy. You mentioned it really briefly in your remarks, and it's something that I hear a lot, especially when I talk about empathy and diplomacy with defense officials. And it sometimes makes me wonder whether we essentially just put strategic in front of empathy to make it a little more palatable for, military planner types. So I just wanted to hear from you whether you think there's a real difference between strategic empathy versus empathy, and what adding strategic to empathy does. Thank you.
It's a great you. Yes, and there is strategic empathy. I actually teach this in Australia, which I feel very privileged to do. I teach strategic empathy in the Asia Pacific, and I think I've landed the dream job because I really love it. The strategic empathy is a form of empathy that's about understanding different perspectives in order to inform better strategy, in order to make more attuned decisions with a longer term vision. I have an article on this in the Journal of Strategic Studies, which is, and for me it's distinct because it's about that political strategic space. So it's really about how do you make sure that those in the highest levels of strategy making are aware of diverse perspectives, and also aware of the implications of the choices that they're making on the broader populations that those decisions might affect. But I also know your concern that there is a danger that we do just put strategic in front of everything, because it sounds far sexier than just empathy. And it also has a harder edge, which I think sometimes you need. I'm very clear that I use the term empathy because for me, it does contain that emotional quality. And I think that's absolutely key. To do strategy, you have to understand emotion. you have to understand how different people feel, how different ideas are going to resonate and be experienced. But strategic kind of softens that emotional aspect of people. And there is the danger that strategic empathy actually becomes another form of people using it to then just basically dominate others. And so there's a difference. So there's some literature that will talk about strategic empathy is how do we win better? How do we beat them better? And that to me is not truly strategic, because you just end up with the same problems that you had before, but in a different form. For me, strategic empathy, as I argue in that article, and I don't talk too much about it in the book, that's the second book, we'll talk more about that. But it's more about how do we understand different perspectives to create a longer term solution to the problems that we face, that takes more people with us on that journey. That might involve compromise and strategy. It definitely means you will probably not be able to have a zero-sum approach. But I think that's good. We live in an environment where we have to work together for collective problems. And so zero-sum is only going to create more problems in the future.
And I will confess to using a term tactical empathy when I teach army generals and colonels. Gentleman there wants to come in. Oh no, sorry, just sorry. Here.
Oh,
sorry. Sorry. Then I'll continue.
Hi Claire, I'm Timmy. I study a short walk away at City University. I wanted to ask, in terms of the forgotten middle, who have in some form, it seems, received empathy from the right, is there a way that, of course it's a bit high-minded to believe that another source of empathy is a true source, but is there a way to win out against the perceived empathy that they're receiving? Or on the flip side, is there a likelihood that true empathy is going to completely, like, continually be undermined by a weaponized form of empathy from the right?
Very topical as well. And I think really, in order to counter the kind of empathy that we've talked about, where certain people are speaking to the forgotten middle, it requires other people to really engage with the issues that are animating and that are most at the forefront of their concerns, and to not shy away from that. And I think it's quite detrimental when we see politicians refer to people as deplorable, refer to people as maybe uneducated or unsophisticated. And that's again about bringing that dignity into politics. We have to start recognizing that all people are part of our political system, but actually then taking those issues. And it might be that you engage with those concerns and you listen to them and you say, well, look, this approach that's being suggested to you doesn't work. But you have to then start to find policies that do work within the bounds of maybe different forms of politics, different kinds of values. And I think it's about going out into those communities, making clear that you are listening. And I think it's interesting, after the election, Bernie Sanders did this a lot. He went out across America and tried to listen and understand what was going on. But I don't think it's for people, maybe with Bernie Sanders politics, it's for people across the political spectrum going out and saying, what's really going on? How do we do it? And make people feel more seen. You're not going to be able to win everyone over. But I think we need to see a bit more dignity within politics to all people, and just more of a dialogue, more of a conversation. But again, with those boundaries and those standards that I mentioned, I think you can have that kind of politics and still say you won't tolerate sexism, racism, xenophobia. And I think we need politicians who can do that, express their boundaries, but also say, what's making you so angry? What's making you feel left behind? What's making you feel unheard?
Question up there, lady right at the back.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Alice from the Foreign Office, but we came across each other many moons ago through the Centre for Empathy and International Affairs, so great to see you again. As a diplomat, I had an IR-related question. Obviously, given that international affairs are dominated by structures and power and interests, how have you managed to continue to carve out a role for understandings on individual perspectives and attitudes and behavior? And do you think there is a way of weaving empathy into structuralist understandings of IR? I mean, you've already spoken about strategic empathy.
Yeah, lovely to see you again, and thank you for the question. International relations is about structures and powers and interests, but for me, it's about ideas. And so I think it's about how those two coexist. So when I teach empathy, I'm very much about, we do work with certain structures and systems, but actually people are absolutely critical in that. And diplomats have this amazing capacity to transform systems and structures so that they work. And I think it's a moment we're in a space where ideas really matter, where narratives matter, and we have to be more attuned to their power, because we can start to rethink those kind of systems and structures that can be constraining. We can rethink power. It was interesting seeing this week one of the elders talk about UN reform. It's something we've seen a lot. Maybe we should be talking about whether that system and structure works for everybody in the best way. There was a really good speech by the Finnish Prime Minister, I think it was, talking about reform for the UN. So in terms of, I'm probably more of a constructivist, and I believe in theory, probably more of a constructivist with a very emotional angle, but I also think there's a huge value in all of them. I think we can't deny the power of ideas of power and interests and security. And so for me, I find it very hard to stay in it. We have to find ways that they talk to each other, and look at what levers you have available. And I think it's people who have the real capacity to change, and what we value as capacity to change, especially if there's a groundswell of opinion that we don't like the way things are, the way power is exerted, the ways the structures are restricted. As power and
Claire, if I'm there is really interesting between some of your published work and literature on humiliation and world politics, and Dominic Moisey's book on geopolitics and emotion, which I recommend, by the way, which could only have been written by a French academic. Anglo-American academics don't write books like that, but we should. But I think there's something interesting here. But and I think most of it ring true, right? Humiliation is something we'll remember for decades, and it can be really material to our sense of self and our sense of policy preferences and choices. And yet that's not always something that we factor in. Biography and emotions matter in policymaking. Right, let's keep it. The gentleman right over there in the corner. So in fact, let's go to this, just for this, the ease of microphone movement. Let's go to this fellow here when we go across. Go.
Thank you very much. Hello, my name's Liam. I'm an ad man. I work for Wieden & Kennedy. We're the largest independent advertising agency in the world. We work for people like Nike and Ford. We, the ad people, designed the current rails of communication upon which we place everything. And those rails in social media, of which you guys have discussed, were designed for commerce. And fundamentally, they are reductive. They're designed for binary choices between buy, sell, now, later. Very, very simple human emotions that are instinctive human emotions, not necessarily ones that you might define as empathetic. Given the commercial onslaught and the fact that we have placed our more complex discourse, our political discourse, upon those rails that were designed for something else, can you give us hope when we're talking upon those channels between each other?
And maybe not sell them from consumption, but maybe offer ideas that there's something else.
Thanks, Claire. I think the skills, one of the ways that we define success, funnily enough, in an ad shop is, does that person play 4D chess? And the senior people are the most empathic people, because they have to. We just talk about thinking around the corners all the time, because all we're doing is selling strong opinions, lightly held. It's all, with the greatest respect to my kin, vapor and value add, because there's a limited amount of assets and commodities in this world, and we have to add value on top of those things. Those skills, I say that as a skeptic, not necessarily a cynic, those skills, of course, can be applied to what you're doing, and there should definitely be discourse between the people in my universe who are designing very, very fast, different ways to communicate. Because if we're not adaptive, we're dead. We're the shark, and if we don't keep swimming, we are dead. And those conversations do exist. Famously, Saatchi's made very, very good adverts for various political sort of parties in this country. Sorry, forgive me. So I think there's definitely an exchange there. The problem, I think, is the force, though, of commerce. I'm fundamentally the canary in the coal mine of, later market capitalism, and we are being, we're paid to flog shit, frankly, and that will always be thus in terms of how that business model works. I guess to turn it back to you and try and turn this into a less, guilt-ridden question. There's a lot of hope in this room when you talk about, empathy. We think about each other. But there is also that tension between the collective and the individual, isn't there, that you guys are talking about? And social media is about individual. Generally, we talk to, it's a one-on-one mechanism. Generally, we look at people. You don't really want to have a conversation with our chips. You want to listen to the person tell us the thing. That's how that works. It's very, very binary. And what you guys are talking about is collective, how we empathize with large amounts of people, all that sort of stuff. And the rails by which we do that, I don't think help you out. And so how do we get around the technology, and how do we get around the force of, all this irregulated commercial stuff that's around us that's making people not talk to each other properly?
The work of a good friend and brilliant expert, Catherine Trebek, and people who work on wellbeing economics. And again, this speaks to what I argue in the book, is that actually our very way we think about society is predicated on certain ideas of success. And a lot of that, for example, is GDP. We need growth. We need this constant idea of growth. But what we're seeing from the kind of state of our environment, from the impact that we're having, that's not sustainable and it's not beneficial. And so there's some really interesting work. The ideas, for example, economics, direct wellbeing economics, this whole movement on wellbeing economics. Places I talk about it in the book, like in Italy, doing a huge amount to transform how they actually organize social structures to make them more collective, to create these kind of more collective economies where there's reciprocity between people, where it's far more sustainable within the environment. And again, it's not a full battle because you're fighting against, like you say, the admin and this kind of drive for commerce and for growth. But again, that is why citizens matter, is it's on us to then say, we want a different kind of economy. We want something that doesn't constantly punish us and keep us in these cycles of need and want and hunger, and is actually about more richer human ideas of prosperity and thriving. And I think we need to be talking about that. And there's been efforts at this. You've got the Gross National Happiness Index from Bhutan. You've got some of these other initiatives that are about how do we find different metrics in society. And I think there's something in that, but it's about socializing that. At the moment, they're popular with certain communities, but they're not mainstream. And for me, I'd like to see far more mainstream conversations about what would an economy look like that served us, that wasn't serving profits, that wasn't serving billionaires. And I'm not an economist, so I can't make the arguments with a great degree of eloquence. But I think for those interested in it, I would look up ideas of wellbeing economics. I'd read donor economics, and just see what's out there. There are a huge amount of collective economic models around the world that seem to be working a bit better for local communities and society.
Now, full disclosure, I'm probably a bit more of a growth is good. But that's a great thing about LSE, right? We can have conversations, we can have debates, so we actually do have different views, and it's okay. But I think there is something just raised in this exchange just now about micro-targeting. So data analytics, one of the things I do at LSE is run an MBA in data science degree. So data science, coding and data science training, people who also do public policy. And I think we do need to be thinking about what's the world of regulation, what's the world of politics, in a world in which, as you say, we've seen a whole-scale transfer of micro-targeting from banking, financial services, retail, into and social media into politics, and with very detailed tools where the sentiment analysis alone, but the sort of salience and ability to both micro-target and target at scale is extraordinary on that. Now, we have another question. I think if we can head back across the room. I'm sorry, we'll catch you in the middle in a minute, but the gentleman right at the back over there, we'll take two from this side. Perhaps if all right, we'll just take, you have to take two at a time, is that right? So why don't we take gentleman there in white and then the lady there, and then we'll come back. Yeah.
So my name's Joe. I'm just a first year undergraduate doing social policy. But I spent some time in Finland, obviously ranked the happiest country in the world as part of like an observational work experience project, I looked at schools in Finland, in Bath, from where I'm from, a more affluent area, and then also inner city Liverpool to try like compare like the socioeconomic conditions and how they impacts policy outcomes. And one thing I found so fascinating about Finland is that they have like emotion lessons once a week, empathy lessons, where they learn about where they talk openly about their emotions, including like envy amongst themselves. And it's definitely an education system which is very materials based, where they learn how to learn how to be good people. One key thing is they start the school at 7. And so I was just wondering, what role do you think education systems can play in promoting and advocating for empathy? And do you think it's almost a failure on Western countries, perhaps like the UK and the US, that that we are experiencing such an empathy deficit?
Thank you, and then to the lady there.
Hi, I'm Misha. So I research on democracy in the Philippines. I'm from the Philippines. So my question is also related with my political context today in my country. Especially, in fragile democracies where populist narratives would thrive in political campaigning, and to an extent, empathy can be twisted and weaponized. How could citizens know when it is authentic or if it is being used as a manipulation tool? Especially with social media at play and the bubble and all the echo chamber that we are in. So yeah, thanks.
Two great questions. To the first one, thank you. And it sounds like you had a fascinating experience with that kind of observational time in places. I absolutely think it's part of our education system. But it's interesting you talked to Finland because they are also in the book. I spoke with one of the ladies who designed the civics education textbooks over there. And it is like, say, it's about empathy and emotion, but it's also about understanding your role as citizens and what role we have to play within societies to be good citizens and to be effective democracy. And having spent 2 years in Denmark, I found as well there's a much greater emphasis on play. I don't know if you've found that in Finland, but young kids are encouraged to play, which helps creativity, it helps social bonding, it helps them feel part of a community. And what's interesting, especially in Denmark, is a lot of people are very close with from a very young age, just because of that kind of process of emotional learning and social bonding. I'll do a plug for an organization that I really love. I think they're doing really important work. Empathy Studios run this initiative called Empathy, and they do a series of videos and a festival basically where they show young people at primary and high school videos of experiences. So they've gone to Nepal, they've gone to Mexico, they've done and they have different themes like resilience, emotional awareness, and they have people talk about their experience of these things, and then have an educational curriculum to support it that then helps young people unpack, well, what does that mean? What experience do I have about that? And to see, one, that they're not alone in some of the things they've experienced, but also that people have done things that are incredibly difficult, hard, and they survived and they cure it. So I think they're doing amazing work. They're currently releasing a video, I think it's every month right now. They just launched a new initiative, but normally you can sign up for, people in schools can sign up to take part in that. So I think it can be taught, and it's something I think we should be looking at in the UK and other countries. How do we bring this in, but also how do we create those environments where things play and teamwork are integral to education? On the second question there about knowing when empathy is accurate, I mean, this is a constant challenge. And in the book, I talk about this idea of sincere empathy and performative empathy. So performative empathy, as I mentioned, is something that, a lot of politicians will do. And I'm sure you have experiences of seeing politicians use the word and not really doing much to back it up. So my argument is that the way to know it's real is it matched by action? And that's why, for me, empathy is connected with integrity in leadership. Are they following up? Are they actually saying, okay, I've said this, but here are the initiatives I'm doing? And that's why I cite Jacinda Ardern as being quite a good example of empathy. When Christchurch happened, she wasn't just at the mosques hugging the victims of that horrific terrorist attack. She initially, she very rapidly introduced gun laws, and she very quickly started working with Justin Trudeau and Emmanuel Macron of Canada and France, respectively, to start addressing online radicalization and sources of extremism. So I think we should be critical about expressions of empathy that seem insincere, and we should expect that it should be matched by action for it to really be meaningful.
I'm going to just test briefly, if that's right. Have we got anybody online? Any questions online? No, that's great. Let's keep going in the room. That's great. We still love you. It's okay, and you can still ask questions like that. Should we bring the lady here, and then perhaps up to the lady there in the middle as well. Great.
Good evening. My name is Alessandra. I'm a student of the Executive Master International Strategy and Diplomacy. My question is, if I look a little bit, I'm a big supporter of strategic empathy, but as I'm an aspirational politician, but if I look at the big leaders, political leaders in the world, like Trump or Xi Jinping or Putin or Netanyahu, I'm not sure who is going to win in terms of empathy. So my question is, what's the risk for the civil society not to have empathic leaders in a mid-long-term vision?
And then up to Linda.
Hello, my name is Binka. I am actually recent Oxford graduate from public policy and policy practitioners for several years. I have actually follow-up question which came from over there, one previous one. We talk about empathy as a part of process of policymaking, but is there something such as empathetic policy action or empathetic policy direction? I understand they are very related, the process of how we make policy and what is the result, but I would like to more maybe understand how can we identify empathetic actions.
Yeah, so thank you very for your questions. To the first question, I mean, my fear is that the absence of empathy creates societies that are far do that community with others, because we're not seeing it modeled from our leaders, and I think we need to see that modeled within politics. We're often told these myths in politics as well, that it's nasty, brutish, and short, and it's each out for their own. And we're seeing that a little bit right now with some of the strong leaders, that it's very much about self-interest and making sure that your own base is secure. And I think that will have short-term benefits. There will be gains that come with it, but I think it's at the expense of longer-term cohesion, longer-term stability within countries and security. And I think it just undermines the ideas of community that we need in order to be able to have societal resilience. And I think there's a number of challenges that we may face, whether that's climate change, whether that's the rapid growth of technology in ways we can't imagine, whether it's natural disasters. We need to have that societal resilience. And if we start to create this quite atomized politics, if we start to see too much of that, we lose those kind of common bonds. And we also lose trust, because we start to think that the politicians aren't really serving any of us. And so I think that's something that really suffers as a result. But as I said, there will be benefits of that kind of politics in the short term. You can deliver quite tangible results quite quickly, but politics is not a quick game. It's complex, it takes patience. So it's a trade-off, but I think in the long term it is detrimental to more effective politics. On the idea of empathetic action, do you mean in terms of other special metrics that we see, or more is it about putting at the heart of policy before you get to the actual implementation?
So, yes, so previously you mentioned that we can distinguish kind of performative empathy from actual empathy by actions, but like how do we know that that action is actually truly empathetic? Say, for example, I will give like an extreme example, imagine there is a terrorist attack coming from a minority. One empathetic response could be, catering into the fear and catering to, for example, right-wing politics of anti-migration. But empathetic could be also, sort of empathizing with minorities and understanding that, oh, after this attack, they could even see more, discrimination, etc. So I wonder, in that policy response, like, how do we identify that the action is truly empathetic?
Thank you for that, I understand. So you're right, in both of those responses you identified could be empathy in a kind of check the box way. For me, the truly empathetic actions are the ones that favor the better angels of our nature. It's more about inclusion, the ones that look to bring people in, that don't look to demonize others, the ones that are able to appeal to connections to one another and to the greater good of community. And I understand within that there are very strong political values on my part that some may very well disagree with. The real empathetic actions are, again, I think like Alexander identified, in my view, they center kindness, they center dignity, they center respect, and they center community. And that doesn't mean that the other form of empathy is not empathy, but it's that I don't think it's as valuable. I don't think it's as long lasting and enduring and effective.
It is interesting, right? Just trying to you can see people be empathetic or not. Are you tend to be listening to others? Are you thinking about citizens? Are you thinking about those who are affected by policy making? I suspect there might then be party and company who are then trying to define empathetic policy making. Each of us are going to have political preferences where we might effectively sort of retreat to our vertical, right? Say empathetic policy making is policy making that I agree with. And actually, the problem here is how do we, to my mind, I think what's so interesting about Claire's work is thinking about how do we use empathy as a bridge to people who have different views to us as well, which I think is very difficult. It doesn't mean we have to agree with them, doesn't mean we can't advocate for what we believe in, but ideally it ought to at least see more mutually respectful politics, even if not always common politics.
Yeah, and I mean in the book we talk, especially this point about the difference between empathy as a means and empathy as an ends. So we see a lot of empathy in the means, in that kind of way to walk and what we expect. But it's the ends, it's about what is it that we're actually creating. It is bridging those divides. It's exactly as you said.
Well, we have 12 minutes left to bridge some of it, guys, and I see 4 hands up. So I'm going to try very hard, if that's all right. Let's take 2 at a time. But can we take 2 at the rear row first, and then we'll come down from there, and then over here. If you can keep questions fairly short, that'd be great, and we'll definitely get over you.
Hi, Claire. I'm a master's student here in human rights. So I would just like to build on the question which previously was asked. There will always be a certain group of people who will feel uncared, unnoticed by the empathy from a certain group of people. So do you really think that being empathetic can bridge a gap or strike a balance between the opinions of certain groups of people? Because when we say that we're being empathetic in our actions, it's not always going to benefit in our case. It's the other party also involved. A lot of power dynamics, other parameters which are involved when we have to take decisions which are on these standards. So do you think will it be able to strike a balance between both the groups involved?
Hello, my name's Dennis. So far, like the whole discussion has been more about Western governments, but I want to take it to a more like an African side. We have a lot of foreign aid coming into Africa. Over the past couple of decades, it's probably over a few billion now, but Africa still looks the same, like it hasn't had any real changes. So it might seem empathetic to everyone who's given to the African cause, trying to make the countries better. But if there hasn't been any change so far, what's the empathy worth? So you can think about it like this. A mother in Malawi, she might have like a few children she needs to take care of. What do you think she's gonna care more about, where her next meal comes from, or
like her voting rights. It might seem empathetic to give her voting rights, but she's going to care more about her food. So I think it matters more where like the results of your empathy than how it makes you feel to do certain things that might seem empathetic.
Yeah, thank you again for two really good questions. On the first one, you're always going to get some people who are excluded and some people who find meaning and belonging in that exclusion. I think the challenge right now is that the balance is out of proportion. Too many people are excluded that don't need to be, that can be brought into the debate by having more honest and frank conversations and by having politics that serves them better. So I think it's not, I don't think you can empathize with everyone, and I don't think everyone is always going to be happy with that empathy. But I do think there are ways that to try and bring more people in to the process. There's too many people outside of politics right now who are disenfranchised or demoralized, really, that we should be addressing. On the second question, yeah, thank you for that. And I think it's a really important thing, you know, who are we to judge our empathy? It's for the people who are the recipients of it. And I would argue that in those processes, part of the policy making of aid delivery should be asking people what they need. What is it that is important to them? And again, I know you can't go and ask every person, maybe in Malawi, but there could be a more effective process of engaging with citizens about what is useful right now and what is a priority. How can there be support? I acknowledge my work is very Western centric, in part because of my own education and professional experience. But I work with, in my current environment in Australia, I work with a number of people who are from Pacific Island nations, and there are other countries that have experienced a huge amount of imperialism in the past and legacies of that, and who will also say now, you know, we don't want Australia to determine what is important for us. We want you to listen. We want you to ask what is needed and to be a part of that. And they're seeing, you know, that often some of the tensions we're seeing in, for example, America and China is because they'll say, well, China listens and delivers what we ask. So I think it's about really looking through those processes of aid, development, and foreign policy, about engaging with people on the ground, with countries as they are and not as we think them to be, and to try and be very conscious of the ways in which empathy can be patronizing if it's not done properly. That goes against the idea of listening, actually having far more constructive dialogue, being very conscious of how those who give aid, those who are making those policies might be perceived, and of where maybe they might be making decisions based on judgments that come from images or projections of the countries and not the reality of the country itself. So I do think that's a key thing, and maybe that's a little bit to some of those ideas about strategic empathy and how states leverage their influence more effectively.
So we've got two more questions. So one from there and one down here. Should we just go to this gentleman here? Whichever one you can get to first.
Thank you. My name is Josh, and I'm a student at the MBA program. So you're at the School of Public Policy. My question is more on the word choice of transform. So I think you used the word transform in your title. Perhaps you were envisioning a current state and an end state, and perhaps you were thinking of a degree of systems change. So just wanted to ask you how perhaps what your version of that end state is, and like where do you see that true transformative change within our current democratic apparatus in the line of empathy?
I have a question up here on
Hello, my name is Yu En. I'm from Seoul University Law Department. And my question is followed by the question mentioned by the young lady, which is about how could the empathy being enacted and put in the action, which is in social policy format. And I considering there's a dilemma where sometimes because the reasons that why we want to use strategic policy empathy and want to put it into policy because we want to solve the conflict between the different opponents. But sometimes this kind of heat, the first is being accumulated over hundreds of years, it needs abandoned time and energy to understand. And another difficulty is that sometimes this heat will be utilized for maintaining the authority, or we call it some kind of dictatorship for some government, which we have to see this kind of political struggle behind different conflict. And as we know, the policy or whether a policy can be successfully enacted always determined by the incorporation with the local forces. So so the intention for us is to solve the conflict. But once the conflict being eliminated, and there is no excuse for the politicians, for the political elites to legitimize their governments sometimes. So I want to ask, in this kind of situation, how could our empathetic policy be truly enacted, and how could we conquer this kind of dilemma? It's a real situation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Claire.
So can I check? It's about how in situations of conflict, after the conflict, we
Yes.
can use empathy.
Without like the local government support, because they have their own consideration due to they don't want this war to be ended sometimes.
Okay, yeah, so it's the
Yeah.
politics within. Again, I mean, I think conflicts, especially particularly for in book, I spoke to one of the negotiators in Colombia about the crisis there, where obviously you have President Santos did a huge job to agree to deal with the FARC. But that also encountered a huge amount of resistance as well, because you have to then sell it to the public. And that's the challenge really with empathy in that kind of diplomacy and conflict spaces. You might have leaders who agree, you might have people who see the overarching benefits of that understanding, but you have to take a far longer game and be patient about how you build it into society. And that's really for me where things like the arts and the humanities, that's where society comes in. That's where leaders have to start to empower, again, organizations beyond the state to take that on and to create opportunities for people who have gone through conflict to come together. That's not something that's going to be quick. And I think we have to be patient. Like empathy hasn't failed just because it's not yielded a quick result. And it's going to encounter roadblocks and setbacks. But that's really about starting to demonstrate the benefits of it. It has to be matched by kind of macro level policies, economic policy, social policies. It's still valuable, but there will always be those domestic, local politics that may have far more nuance and complexity to navigate. But again, by creating that, by using different civil society levers, by having a bigger narrative about what's possible, I think that's one way to come to get through that. And I saved your question for last because it was about transformation. I'm very reluctant to give the full answer because I'm hoping it is in the book. But I mean, for me, right now, I find that politics is demoralizing. It's left a lot of people apathetic, and it's not very inspiring. And it's not for want of inspiring individuals, and it's not for want of competent and capable people in positions of power. I want to see a politics that really empowers more people to engage. I want us as citizens in a transformed kind of state to start stepping up and being a part of it. And I know already, you know, a lot of people are. I know there's a lot at the moment in the UK in terms of protests and activism, but also it's about citizen dialogue. It's about those assemblies. It's about civil society. It's about being a part of community and taking part and taking ownership and responsibility for the decisions that are made, not just leaving it to other people to do so. I'd like to see systems and structures that are more just, that are more equitable. I want to see more people included. I want to see an expansion of representation. I want to see more women, more people of color, more diversity in those who represent us within society. It's still very much, white men in positions of power. It's not that they're not capable, but there's also many people from different communities who should be there just as rightly. I want to see us transform our economic system to make it more inclusive, to make it reward people in a more sustainable and just way. And I want us to have the difficult conversations. I think that's what's missing right now. This is a moment of reckoning, I think. And I think we should start to lean in. What is not working? Like really not working? And let's listen to different people's perspectives. And if some people think that it is working, let's hear why. Even if we disagree, if there are people who feel they're absolutely let down, let's hear why. And let's start to say, what does the end game look like? It can be at a small level, that your trains work on time, that you're not cramped, that they're not dirty. It could be at the macro level. It's about, you know, that there's societies that are just and fair. And so it's across all of those different political games. I fear that I have not done justice to all of that in a book. I think there is a whole other book about the end state in itself. But yeah, there's certainly some of that vision in there.
Look, huge thanks to Claire, and I'll ask us to collectively thank her in a moment. But can I just do a very short advertorial, because obviously this is one of the series of events we run as the School of Public Policy. And coming up next in November, we have the CEO of Greenpeace, the CEO of Plant Earth, and Britain's former climate negotiator, talking about what are the best pathways. Is it lawfare, policy, or direct action? If you're thinking about issues like climate. In November 2, we will be joined by Jason Burke, the Guardian international security correspondent, who will be talking to me about his new book on revolutionaries, looking at the evolution of radical left groups and radical terrorist groups in the late 60s and early 70s, but also what the legacy is from that in terms of politics today as well. So please do join us, folks. I'll be advertised on the usual channels. But it just goes for me to say thank you very much, Claire, for joining us, travelling all the way from Australia, although for a range of things this week. But fascinating conversation. I didn't see anybody fall asleep. You're all practicing the right kind of empathy this evening. And my thanks too to Carolina and the team for organising and setting this event up. But huge thanks, and let's join the meeting.